Wonderful. So, hello to everybody who's watching. Today, I have the pleasure and honor to interview Claudia Russo. Claudia is the SDM's Director for Public Affairs in the EU and Global Deputy Director of Public Affairs. Claudia, it's such a pleasure to have you with us today to talk about preservation. Would you like to say a little bit more about what you do?
Sure. And first of all, thank you for having me representing my organization. Really a pleasure to be having this conversation. As you say, I am Director for Public Affairs EU, so my focus is really on EU policy primarily. I've worked on digital and research and innovation policy in Brussels for a number of years. But as of last year, I'm also looking after, supporting really the rest of my team on our global engagement. Of course, there are many issues that are very similar around the globe. So that's really stimulating and hopefully helps us, being as effective and coherent as possible.
That's wonderful. And to everybody who's watching and don't know me, my name is Gali. I work at CLOCKS, the Digital Preservation Organization. And we are today here to talk about preservation in the context of STM. And Claudia, let me start by asking you, we all see the explosion of scholarly publishing, whether it's journals or books. It really is incredible. From your perspective at the SDM Association, are we keeping it up when it comes to preservation? I mean, we are producing a lot, but do we really keep up with preserving all this content from what you can see?
Yeah, so thank you for that. And I think it's actually a really timely conversation that we're having. You may know that as STM, we partner with other associations in scholarly publishing to work and award the Rosenblum Award. I think it was announced shortly after you contacted me about this conversation.
Yeah,
It was announced that the award this year was going to be recognized in favor of digital preservation of
I
the
saw that.
scholarly
Yes.
records, right? So
Yes.
it's certainly something that we care about, and the Rosenblum Award in itself was created to recognize these game-changing advancements that has stood the ideas of time. And really, the ideas and technologies, not necessarily the organizations or the people behind them.
Mhm.
So it's really telling that this is just the second time that we give it out, and it's really telling that so early on in the process, let's say,
Yeah.
digital preservation was recognized. So definitely important and definitely on our radar. But you asked about sort of the explosion of scholarly publishing, and I think of that in two different ways, potentially. So there is certainly the impact of AI that we're seeing. So,
Yeah.
we've been publishing a lot over the past years, but we're seeing now an increase in submissions. So is that going to mean that we publish maybe even potentially more? So that's sort of an open question. And actually, from what I hear from our members, the answer is not going to necessarily be yes. We're not necessarily going
Mm.
to publish more because we receive more. So it may be that actually, the final published output remains the same, but there is some other implications essentially for the publishing process because of the submissions. And then the other bit that you say is, relates to this output diversification. Um,
Mm.
we certainly for now do preserve the journal article. I think that, the majority of STM
Yeah.
members are in the journal article business. And I know that for all of them, preserving that is super important. But what about data sets, databases, code, software? I do think that, the preservation of those types of materials is at a different stage, not less important, but just at a
Mhm.
different stage. Also because,
Right.
naturally, the evolution of these formats, some of these, and maybe also the formats that we know now will be evolving, will become more interactive.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's about knowing that preservation is something that needs to happen so that as
Mm.
these pieces actually become more part of what we do, what we produce, we know that
Yeah.
those should also be preserved. And
Yeah.
maybe let me finish with one thing for now, and then I can pause. Maybe what is important is going to be important to consider is, do we need to preserve all? Because of course, like with
Mm.
the multiplication of the objects to preserve,
Mm-hmm.
and the space that those take,
Yeah.
the implications for storage and so on, what do we
Right.
actually need to preserve? I think the conversation that I have now on so many, on different fronts, is, there's so much information out there. How do you filter it, and how do you discover it? How do you get to the right object, the right word, the right
Right.
article? I think
Right.
it could be similar for preservation, although, preservation has also different objective. But maybe I can pause here for now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you touched on a couple of very, very interesting points. One is, and I was going to ask you, and I think you answered it, that when you speak to publishers, and you do, right, as a part of your position and your work and the association work, I was going to ask, and it sounds like publishers are aware of the need to preserve the content. So from that perspective, and what you bring up now is like, okay, I think the awareness is there. We can see it in the activities. And now we have to think about other formats that need to be preserved. And that's where the new challenge, right, appears, right? Like, how can we preserve all these other outputs that are out there?
Sure, there's that, and there's also something that is maybe difficult to think about at the outset. But how do we make sure that we keep on preserving all the relevant formats also over time as they evolve? So, there's
Mm,
that like inherent complexity in the job. Um, Apart then from sort of the newer formats, and like looking forwards, like sort of that preparedness
yeah,
conversation, there's also probably like differences within the publishing ecosystem.
hmm,
Before this, I was looking at some data that actually shows that not all journal articles are equally preserved, or have
mm,
equally clear policies, and I think that speaks to actually resources,
yeah,
and that can be related to a publisher having just been set up and having
right,
to professionalize essentially throughout time. I
yeah,
think that like most established publishers do have a clear digital archiving policy, know how
right,
to deal with it, they have workflows in place. But there could be sort of an evolution for new publishers, and there could be sort of recurring difficulties for those publishers that just have resource constraints.
right, right,
Preservation is work, right? And we were talking
yeah,
about storage before, and you need skills and you need the people. Um, and especially because preservation is about making sure that access to the relevant corpus is maintained throughout time. Like
yes,
systems can fail, so it also means that you
hmm,
may want to invest in more than one preservation mechanisms, piece of
that's
infrastructure.
right, yes,
And
yes,
and that becomes limiting for publishers who have less resources,
right,
or in particular disciplines that are also less funded. So I also don't want to suggest that that the work is done and already completely in place for all type of journal publishers. For
right,
for that format that we already do work with for
Right.
some time.
Right. And in your job, in your current position, do you see differences? You mentioned a little bit of data, but do you see differences within, even within Europe? Do you see differences in preservation levels between regions in Europe or within, you mentioned disciplines?
So I think it's less in Europe that we see a difference. I think,
Mm,
like I hear Global South actors raising
yes.
issues about the preparedness and infrastructure that is in place there already. And I think
Mhm.
there was a study some time ago that sort of found that journals in social and human sciences disciplines
Yeah.
were more likely to have vanished over time. And these again links to what I was talking about before in terms of just the funding that is available in different pockets in different fields.
Right. Right.
Um, this is not sort of the space where I spend most of my time, so I don't have like this sort of super granular
Yeah. No, of course.
data, but I think that this is what I have heard or picked up so far.
Right. One of the things that you mentioned was the importance of collaborations and between, I guess, preservation services and publishers and libraries. From your experience, can you tell us a little bit more about what you see are that are the important components of that collaboration and how SDM, for example, is aligning with that or supporting that.
Mm. So, I mean, I think preservation is one of the areas where you see collaboration work more concretely between publishers, libraries, and other stakeholders because of the models that have emerged, and also like sort of the shared responsibility that is felt across
Right.
the different actors.
Yeah.
Looking at things from a different mission, maybe, or a different angle, but I think that it is clear that this has emerged as one of the areas where there needs to be collaboration, and there are sort of similar, well, essentially the same goals involved.
Right. Right.
Um, in terms of the work at SDM, I mean, like partnership is very much in our chords. And what we've also worked on is, setting up standards or best practices. So this is certainly one of our usual outputs from sort of internal work streams. I
Right.
also have to say, like we're a sort of a membership-driven organization, and I haven't heard of like sort of any immediate needs in terms of, again, new standards or best practices from the
Yeah.
publishers alone. So it's not something that we've been doing in terms of really like coming up with new initiatives within STM only. But we're open again to the requests of
Yeah.
our members and ready to work where there is a clear need. More indirectly, where a lot of our work is focused is to make sure that the quality, integrity, and traceability of the content that
Yeah.
is published is in place, so that also that quality can be ideally preserved over time, right? So I think that there's a lot of work that we've done in the past as well that sort of relates more indirectly.
Yeah. Mm.
Um, I would surely mention this Rosenblum Award as well, that this year recognizes preservation in the sense that that is sort of that important awareness work as well that needs to be done.
That-
So I was very happy again of sort of this synergy because it shows that there's some instruments that we have to give visibility to important
Yeah.
needs and initiatives within our sector. So
Right.
I would definitely mention that. And maybe, like again, on sort of the side effects of or spillover effects of some of the other initiatives that we're involved with. We have this initiative that is called SNSI on network infrastructure security. And that's
Mm-hmm.
also something that we partner on with universities and libraries. So again, in terms of making sure that our common infrastructures are as secure as possible and defended
Right,
from outside attacks. And that has to do with, just the content that can be accessed, outside of an emergency, as well
right,
as how do we make sure that these systems are resilient also in sort of
right.
more emergency situations.
Yes, yes.
So, like different directions, but I think everything is connected in the end. So,
Yeah. No, so and we've been talking with people, we've been interviewing and doing this type of conversations with a lot of people around the world. And one of the things that came up was repositories, right? Because all this data is there, the content is there, and then what do we do to ensure that all this content, right, is preserved, is protected? So what you say really, really resonates, right? Especially because there's some library publishers, but there's also repositories of both. And I think raising awareness to that is also very, very important. And when we talk about awareness, you talked about the Rosenblum Award, and I'm going to um, put a link to that after, yes, after after our talk. Um, do you feel like from your European perspective, do you think or do you feel that policymakers and not just the publishers of the libraries, maybe they realize the importance, but if you feel like policymakers are aware of this need to preserve and protect this content as well, at least in Europe?
hmm. I can bring maybe two perspectives for Europe. And first of all, I would say that this is one of our, speaking points with policymakers. Because
Mm,
when we try to communicate what it is that publishers actually do,
yeah,
it goes much beyond just putting the PDF online. And
right.
preservation is certainly part of the, like a number of things that publishers do from submission to publication, but then also beyond, making sure that access is always ensured. So I would say I hope that there is a bit of awareness, at least because we've been talking to policymakers about
Right.
this. So I hope that the understanding of what publishing entails and also accessing these resources is
Mhm.
evolving, and I hope that we're contributing to that as well.
Right.
And also, like it's always very difficult to talk about these sort of invisible processes, or because preservation is something that isn't really recalled in the day-to-day work, then it's very easy to forget that it's there, or the costs also that go into it.
Right.
So a
Right.
thought that I had recently was, well, and regarding preservation, but regarding many other topics as well. Maybe because we're having so many conversations around AI, that will help visualize or concretize things a bit more. Because, like people
Right.
are starting to realize, like, what does it take to have AI models that work? Well, you need
Mm,
electricity and you need data centers and you need the people who filter the data. So maybe that helps in sort of realizing all of the work that goes on behind the scenes,
right.
also
Right. True.
really in terms of infrastructure.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's also something, like I talk with policymakers about AI quite a bit. So maybe that's, where different arguments and different, sort of different topics do share some
Right.
general concepts, and sort of, those can help each other in
Mm,
making policymakers visualize things better. And the other thing on Europe that is going to be interesting to see is the evolution of Open Research Europe,
yes.
the publishing platform of the Commission.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
so far, I think what I saw is they have a policy that regards depositing into Zenodo, which is like a
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
repository.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that is probably sort of like a first step and less professionalized than having, really like professional channels and mechanisms in place to be
Right.
triggered in cases of emergency. So it's going to be interesting if that sort of awareness about the need to preserve
Right.
also translates into an actual policy for the platform, for instance. And it's
Right.
really early days, and I don't know if anyone from Open Research Europe will be watching this, but that's something very
We,
concrete. I think that
yeah.
we could be looking at. Um,
Oh,
and maybe
absolutely. Yeah.
final thing, and very quickly, hopefully this can also translate into the recognizing the need for funding also for preservation, because like when thinking
Absolutely.
about how to enable this, we said costs are there and resources are needed. So when
Right.
funding, like research and innovation projects, how do we make sure that actually things are also preserved in the
Yeah.
long term?
True. Yeah, and you said something really interesting, and I want to spend a minute or two on that. You said, preservation is not a part of, at the moment, of the daily work, right? The publisher has, submissions and peer review and all this, and preservation right now is something kind of separate. So it doesn't really go into the workflows, I guess. And maybe this is something that needs to be changed, right? Like what needs to evolve, where you publish, you secure, and then you publish, you have your servers, and then you preserve, and it's a part of your workflow, right? And that's maybe a way.
And I think that is absolutely necessary. And I can't speak for, like for publishers when they put together their workflows and when they think about, like their products and
Yeah.
offers, how much they do have that in mind. But I do think that a lot of them actually do, and especially, like in a sort of professionalized publishing environment. I guess that what I meant is, like in the everyday, and also thinking from a researcher perspective,
Right.
when they do need to access content, they don't have in mind, oh, but is this preserved in the long term? Because they need to access today
Mm.
and now, right? So, like what I meant to say is, it's not something that is as visible to the outside, or it's not
True.
something as tangible in the day to day, because we're just not in that particular context.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Or like a publisher is still in business, and like so until you actually reach that moment when something gets triggered, nothing is visible to the outside as to the infrastructure that is behind, that though is there and is in
Right.
place for the moment when it will be needed.
When things are needed, and especially now, I feel, when we see so many disruptions, globally and geopolitical, shifts, I think now is more important than ever to bring up this preservation issue, just because we see what is going on, and all of us are aware that at any given time anything can happen, and one thing can fail, and then we lose all the things and all the content. And I think it's a very, again, very timely conversation. Claudia, one last question for you before we close. um, so from your perspective, and me, I work for clocks, and and I'm talking about other preservation services. What do you think we should be doing, um, or together, to raise more awareness, or to make preservation a real part of the workflows, and so forth, from your perspective?
Yeah, so these type of dialogues really helps already. Like I spent some time thinking about this, and I think, intentionality really matters in the people and then in the organization. So even just having these type of conversations sort of puts things into motion. And then again, as I was mentioning, we're sort of driven by our membership needs, but equally, we're very happy to, like especially now, actually, we're ongoing sort of strategy review, and we're sort of mapping out, okay, like what are the gaps, what needs to be solved in the next 2, 3 years from a
Yeah,
policy or technical perspective. So we're definitely
right.
mapping, where there are gaps and potential for us to work collaboratively, always within, the boundaries of competition law that is also there, and that's
Yeah,
something that
of
we
course.
need to be careful about. So we are in that phase, in that exercise. So it's really interesting for us to hear from your organization, other organizations, to understand what could be, really meaningful
Yeah.
and effective actions that we can take. I think over
Mm.
the past years, we've also seen a number of reports that were really interesting from Ithaca.
Mm.
And I can send you a couple of links afterwards to make sure that you also capture
Oh yeah,
those.
that'd be great. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so there was a report in 2024 about the second digital revolution in scholarly publishing. And
Mm.
then, because of generative AI, they sort of added also a third revolution report, and that is more
Mm.
specifically about AI. But in there are a couple of things about preservation as well, also really pointing towards collaboration and scoping out, what is needed. A lot of that is really linked to this idea of the atomization of the article, so with
Yeah.
ideally the version of record at the center, but then with a lot of corollary materials
Mm.
also around it. How do you make sure that you maintain the right links and connections in between all of those?
True. True. Yes.
From our perspective, what is really interesting to see is really the evolution of the industry, and how can we make sure that we keep on doing, performing our function of stewards of the
Mm-hmm.
scholarly record. How do we make sure that things are connected but equally verified and preserved,
Right.
at the end of it? So I think that would just be, my thought. We're really open to any particular thing that we should be working on. I don't think that we're
Mm-hmm.
in a crisis, but it's really interesting to see how our sector is shifting, and we need to make sure that all of our sort of core functions are carried forward, including, of course, preservation. So commitment is there, and very happy to continue this
Yes,
conversation.
absolutely. It's been such a pleasure. Let me stop the recording here for a second so we can say goodbye. But it's been a pleasure to talk to you, Claudia, and I really want to thank you for taking the time to do this today.